Well, hello and good morning. Welcome to another virtual visit here at the Alaska SeaLife Center. My name is Alex, and today we're going to be talking about a part of the SeaLife Center that you don't necessarily always see, and that'll be our wildlife response program. First, of course, we're going to take a look at our sunrise this morning. We've been trying to do time lapses. Unfortunately, this morning time lapse didn't work out, but we did get two shots. This first one is actually from about 8 o'clock, which is when our time lapses have been starting. And you can see we are getting pretty dark at that time of the morning. And then the next one's even a little later on, closer on to about 10 o'clock or so, sometime in the 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock there. And the sun's still not really past the mountains. So even if we had a time lapse, I think by the time we were starting to get set up this morning, it was still pretty dark. But we're going to keep trying to do that. Keep trying to bring you here to the SeaLife Center as part of these virtual visits, kind of show you our weather changing through the year as we go on into the winter. And of course, with these virtual visits, we would like to thank our sponsors. So this season of virtual visits is, of course, generously sponsored by the Royal Caribbean Group, and they make it possible for us to bring you these virtual visits live, where the public can just travel to Alaska through the wonder of the internet. So, as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about a part of the SeaLife Center that you don't really see. What I have behind me is actually probably your best bet at seeing it when you visit the SeaLife Center in person. What's behind me is what we call the ICU. And the ICU, we're actually up on the second floor of the SeaLife Center. We're across from the touch tanks, if you remember that episode. And these windows view down into the first floor. And sometimes if we have animals here, wild animals undergoing treatment, we will actually have them down there and the public can kind of see some of that treatment that they're undergoing. But by and large, the Wildlife Response Program is kind of an unseen thing. We do put out press releases when animals come in. We do try to get videos of any animals that are released, and we try to update the public when these animals are here being treated, where they might go in the future. But unfortunately, just out of the nature of wildlife responses, you're going to find out a lot of it just kind of goes on out of the view of the public. But we're going to kick on over to our first clip today. Working at the Alaska SeaLife Center means that many of the questions I get asked pertain to our wildlife response program. Unfortunately, due to quarantine protocols and a need to maintain separation between wild animals and humans, that remains very much a behind-the-scenes program at the SeaLife Center. For today's virtual visit, we want to give you a glimpse into the workings of the Wildlife Response Program here at the Alaska SeaLife Center. Our team answers calls about sick, injured, orphaned, or otherwise stranded marine mammals and seabirds from all along the shores of Alaska. Many of those animals are transported to the Alaska SeaLife Center, where they can receive hands-on care and treatment for any injuries or illnesses they might have, even maternal care if they're still in their infancy. Once those animals are healed enough and strong enough, sometimes even just old enough to survive, many are released back out into the wild. And for any that can't be released, we'll arrange permanent care, either at the Alaska SeaLife Center or a similar facility. For today's virtual visit, we are going to follow along in the journey that two young harbor seal pups had in our wildlife response program earlier this summer. These two pups came to us from Resurrection Bay, right behind the SeaLife Center, our very own backyard. And one of them was even found stranded on this very beach, within sight of the SeaLife Center itself. The 12th harbor seal of our 2021 wildlife response season came from just around the corner of the SeaLife Center. And since it was so near, the wildlife response team was able to really quickly get over there and lay eyes on the animal. And it was a small harbor seal pup. That being said, it was late enough in the summer, this was actually in July, that the animal had weaned already. And so it was an independent pup away from mom, but it wasn't behaving in a normal manner. But it had been hauled out on this beach for quite some time. And our wildlife response team did keep eyes on it for a few days and determined that it wasn't getting better. It did appear to be losing weight. And so it was felt that it did need our assistance. Now you can see here, they kind of go over a game plan. How are we going to get this animal You want to make sure you're in control of the situation with this sort of thing. And you want to make sure that animal can't, bite anyone or bolt into the water. As a marine mammal, if it got into the water, it's gone. But they were able to just kind of keep it contained with those boards and then get in there with the net. And once it was in the net, able to get a towel over top of it. And this keeps it from thrashing around, keeps it from either hurting itself or scratching or biting at the people trying to help it. And that's the big takeaway here whenever I speak with someone at the center about the Wildlife Response Program, is that these are wild animals. And certainly, if you're walking the beach and you see a marine mammal, if you see a seal or a bird that looks injured or sick, or you're worried it needs help, please call someone like the Alaska SeaLife Center, or if you're not in Alaska, a local aquarium or zoo, or even a state or federal body in charge of wildlife in your region. Please don't approach these animals. Don't touch them or pick them up or transport them yourselves. We don't want anyone to get bit or for the animal to be put in a worse situation. So here you can see they were able to get that animal into that kennel and they're just going to walk it right on up to the van. Now, we respond to calls all around the state. This one was unusually close to home, but there are many times that the animals either aren't directly on the road network or are pretty far away that we can't respond in person right away. So we have partners around the state of Alaska, and sometimes it involves this animal getting put in a kennel, and then that kennel getting loaded onto a plane, and then our van meeting that plane at another airport. It can be a big process to get these animals not only to the SeaLife Center, but for release to get the animals back to where they were found. Fortunately, in this case, it was literally around the corner from the SeaLife Center. You're going to see here really briefly just how long it took for us to get that animal back to the center and get started on its care. All right, so we just saw how our wildlife response program actually picks those animals up. We get calls from all around the state. This one was just really convenient because it was literally around the corner from us. But when we do get these calls, we want to be able to see these animals. We want to observe these animals. We want to make sure that they do need help. And so we always want to stress, please do not pick up or try to collect any wild animals yourself that you think may need help. And we actually, we do have a hotline, and we have posters that kind of go out to harbors and parks, that sort of thing. If you do see an animal you think is in need of help, please call our hotline. It's right there, 1-888-774-7325. Of course, if you're outside of Alaska, you will have local agencies that can help you with that. But we never want anyone to approach these animals, pick them up, or anything like that. We do have partners that once we receive a call, we can have them get out there, observe these animals, and in fact, if you call us and you're kind of out in a really remote area, we might ask that you observe that animal for a period of time. So you might even become a little bit of a partner for that particular rescue. Now, I want to say that if you have any questions throughout this entire program, please do type those in the chat, or we of course have the text line down in the description below, and you can text those questions in. Laura is running the computer today. Laura, do we have any questions yet?
Yeah, we had one that came in. What's the coolest animal that you've rescued?
The coolest animal that we have rescued here at the SeaLife Center. Well, for my time here, we have had some pretty neat ones. My favorite is probably Aku the walrus. So we had a walrus a few years back that came in from Nome, had kind of pulled himself up into a dredging barge, and wasn't doing so well. And so when that animal came in, we were able to work with Aku. So walruses, really cool. We also had a little baby beluga at that time. And an animal I haven't personally interacted with in wildlife response, but that I always just love when they're here. They're very cute. Obviously, I'd rather they be out in the wild, but those are northern fur seals as well. All right, any other questions?
What if you get an animal that's too big to bring back to the center?
Oh, that actually kind of ties into, like with the beluga, right? What if we get an animal that's too big to bring back to the center? Well, in the case of the beluga, Tyonek, he was small. So we were able to bring him here. We did have a little enclosure that we could have him in for treatment and that sort of thing. But if we ever got an animal that was just too large, if we had a full whale show up on a beach, we would still be involved in the response to that animal, but of course we're not going to transport that animal here. So if there's a large stranding somewhere, we can still help that animal, but it may not get transported to the SeaLife Center itself. Now, regarding that transportation, let's check out our second clip of what happens once they get here. Once a wildlife response patient arrives at the SeaLife Center, this clinic is their first stop. Here, our vet team will do an admit checkup with each animal that arrives. This checkup is looking at baseline health of the animal when it first gets here. They'll take measurements such as weight, length, girth. They'll also take blood samples and mucus samples from nasal swabs or fecal swabs. The other thing they're looking for is anything that might not be so obviously wrong with the animal. When they collect these animals on scene at a beach or if someone finds them in their boat, there might be things that are very obviously wrong with the animal. If it's not responsive, or if it's got large contusions or cuts, or if it's got a broken bone, those can be obvious, those can be seen. But there are many things that could be wrong with these animals that aren't so easily seen, such as diseases, parasites, simply being dehydrated or underweight. And the ADMET checkup is a useful tool to better understand the full scope of any animal that comes in. What sort of care do we need to provide? So after that short van ride that we saw earlier, PV 2112 arrived at the Wildlife Response Clinic here at the SeaLife Center. So this is the 12th harbor seal of our 2021 season, or PV 2112. And you're going to just basically see their ADMIT checkup. This is what happens when an animal first arrives at the SeaLife Center. So our staff's going to get in there. They're going to take a bunch of samples, blood samples, fecal samples. Here they're going to be getting that nasal swab, kind of getting some mucus from inside the nose. And all of these samples are going to be processed to look at the general health of the animal. Does it have any conditions we should know about? Now, PV 2112 actually came in with some cuts and scratches and scrapes, but mostly underweight and dehydrated. There was another harbor seal pup that came in this season that was in much worse shape. You're actually going to see them in just a little while. And in fact, that was PV 2111, so the seal just before this in the season. And that one also came from Resurrection Bay, right behind the SeaLife Center. Now, one of the things you'll notice here is that there's always someone kind of taking notes as they're going through and getting these samples, as they're collecting these various samples and swabs and measurements. There's lots and lots of note taking. It's really important that we maintain records for these animals. Just like in a hospital for human care, you might be moving, from treatment to treatment, or you might kind of be passed off from one caregiver to another. And so having a paper trail, having records of all of the treatment that this animal has undergone, the treatment that it's still undergoing, very important. So this is a multi-person job. And you can see right in the middle here, Hallie's actually been kind of just holding that animal for a lot of this. We want to make sure that the animal is pretty restrained during these procedures. Obviously, we're trying to help the animal, but the animal likely doesn't know that, right? And so we want to make sure that they're not thrashing around too much. We want to make sure that they're not going to hurt themselves or hurt anyone trying to help them. And that's just kind of part of this job, is these animals come in, they're injured, they're scared, they're already stressed. And we want to make sure that this process is as efficient and quick and as little extra stress as possible for the animal. So I mentioned PV 2111 earlier, the 11th harbor seal of the season. This is PV 2111, and as you can see, they came in not as great a shape as 2112. So they did have to get put under for this operation, but they came in with several puncture wounds, bites, scratches, possibly from an attack that happened in the water, or sometimes these animals do get sort of harassed and harried on the shore by birds as well. But regardless, PV 2111 required a lot of care. They had to go through, clean all these wounds. You can see them administering drugs, administering fluids, disinfecting these wounds. They're going to give the animal some pain medication. And basically, it's a whole process. You can see multiple people around there. This footage is from a little later after that operation. A lot of those wounds had healed up real nicely. And so it's not just the admit checkup. Any animal that comes in and requires care is going to get checked up throughout the entire process. That way we can track how well they're recovering, how well their treatment is going, that sort of thing. Now, even though these wounds had healed up pretty nicely, there was still some work to be done. You can see them there taking pictures of the wounds and how well they're healing, that sort of thing. And they did have to actually get in and do some stitches on some of these wounds as well. So we do have sort of a team here that does it all, right? Everything from surgery to raising little pups off bottles and that sort of thing. It's a whole adventure. All right, so that is the admit checkup that all these animals go through when they first get here. And you know, we had mentioned before PV 2111 and PV 2112, they came from Resurrection Bay. So it was really quick from actually getting them and then to the center, they could get right into that clinic. And so we were able to get a good look at their health. It looks like we've got a couple questions in. Laura's got?
Yeah, somebody was wondering, how do you pick their names or maybe a theme?
Okay. Yeah, so we do name them, and the name in the system is that PV 2112 or 2111. And so that's for the species of harbor seal, which is Phoca vitulina or vitulina or vitulina. We heard 3 different pronunciations of it while we were talking about this. But the harbor seal, and then 21 is for 2021, and then 11 or 12 for the 11th or 12th seal. Now that's just what they are in this system, but they of course do get names. You can't help but name small critters when they come in. And there are themes. So this year's themes, or this year's theme for our wildlife response was different types of pasta. So ultimately, 2111 and 2112 were vermicelli and gemelli. And vermicelli, like, I don't know, are there Easter eggs with this sort of thing? I guess so. This is the Easter egg for it. A lot of these animals come in with parasites. Vermicelli means little worms, because it's little noodles like little worms. And indeed, 2111 was full of worms. So there's your little trivia about the name. But yeah, pasta was the theme this year. And in the past, we've had other themes. We've had like national monuments. We've had, I've heard like cookies and candies before as well. So kind of different every year. And that actually follows with a lot of our departments here. So if we have birds born at the SeaLife Center, for example, within a breeding season, there's a theme for any birds that are born. Or some of our monitoring of wild animals. If we see animals born on Chiswell Island, which is actually a sea lion rookery we can talk about in another program, those animals also get naming themes. So we do have a good time here naming these animals. Any other questions there, Laura?
Kind of going from a super fun one to kind of a dark one. What happens when they die in our care? Okay,
so of course we do try to save these animals. You know, we bring them in, we give them the treatment we can. Sometimes animals just won't make it, right? It is a sad truth. And sometimes, you know, when we get the call, the animal's already dead on the beach, or by the time we can even transport it, it does pass away. And in those cases, we do still want to bring it here, and we do still want to know what was wrong with that animal. And so we'll bring it here, we'll do a necropsy, kind of like autopsy, right? But the auto in autopsy refers to self, to humans. So a necropsy is doing the same procedure just with these animals. And that can give us a lot of information about, you know, what was wrong with that animal, you know, parasites, diseases, injuries. And it's very important that we get that information, even from an animal that has passed on, because that information can help us with future animals that come in. Either we can be made aware of some sort of danger or threat or hazard to these animals out there, or if we see an animal in the future that has very similar symptoms or signs, then we might be kind of on a path to a better understanding what might be wrong with it. So that's why, even if an animal passes away, we can gain a lot of important information that helps future wildlife response calls.
We have one more right now.
Okay.
Somebody wants to know how they can help.
How can you help? So, like I said, if you are just walking the beach and you see like a little seal pup and you're worried, hey, maybe it's on its own, maybe it's been abandoned or orphaned, or if you see something that's very clearly injured or sick, please don't hesitate to either call the SeaLife Center if you are in Alaska. We've got that number up right there. Or you can call your local agencies. If you're somewhere like a park or a preserve, of course there's staff there that can help. But usually any zoo, again, please report any injured or sick marine animals that you might encounter.
We had another one come in.
Okay.
How do you feed a sick animal if it is not wanting to eat in the wild?
Ooh, that is actually a great question. Of course, at the very beginning, we had like this very cute footage of a little baby sea otter getting bottle fed, and that's like everyone's ideal. Oh, that'd be great, right? And there's a couple reasons it's not necessarily an ideal. One is that when you are bottle feeding an animal, that actually makes it a non-release candidate. So we will bottle feed animals that are non-release, but otherwise we want to be really hands-off. And tube feeding is a big way to approach that. One of the things about tube feeding is it's not probably the most pleasant experience, right? Having this tube kind of fed down to your stomach, and then you get a little syringe of formula or vitamins. But that animal's not going to get released out into the wild and just pine for those good old days of getting tube fed, right? So one of our big things with animals here is that we want them to make it back out into the wild. We want to be able to release them. Not all the animals are release candidates, but those that are, they will be tube fed if they're, if they're in infancy. Things like harbor seals, for example, we can tube feed those. We won't bottle feed them. Tube feeding is just really quick. It's one and done. And you could do that with a sick animal as well. That's kind of like, oh, I don't want food. Now, if they're just regurgitating food, that's a whole other problem. And you can move on to things like, intravenous injections, that sort of thing. But yeah, we do a lot of tube feeding here. And then, of course, once the animals are old enough, we can move on to like solid foods, providing fish for them and that sort of thing. But you're actually going to have to tune in next week for our virtual visit to see the rest of the journey for these two harbor seals. Today we saw their capture, where they were called into our wildlife response program. They went out there, they got them, and we saw their admit checkups. Next week, we're actually going to see kind of the conclusion of their journey here through our wildlife response program of PV 2111, 2112, or vermicelli and gemelli. Any other questions there, Laura, before we sign off?
Not right now.
All right. Well, if you think any questions, if you just bolt awake in the middle of the night going, oh my gosh, what about this, what about that, you can always comment on this video down below, or you can email us with any questions or maybe ideas for future episodes on asktuffy@alaskasealife.org. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this first little glimpse into our wildlife response program, and I hope you'll join us again in the future to see more. And until then, so long.